I'm joined by Dr. Abigail Favale. Abigail is professor at the McGrath Institute in Notre Dame University. You're welcome, Abigail. I have met Abigail through two books, Into the Deep and The Genesis of Gender, both of which I enjoyed very much. I'm talking to you today because in recent times in Ireland, the question of women's ordination has come up. And I, in one interview, presented the church's teaching that the church does not feel itself authorized to ordain women. And I thought I'd like to explore it with you today. First of all, just let me present what I think are the reasons the church has given. And they are that there is the fact of the practice of Jesus. Jesus chose 12 men to be apostles. At the Last Supper, which was a pivotal moment, we Catholics believe in the institution of the sacraments. The 12 apostles were present, and we will even say, using the language of today, they were ordained as the first priests. It can be argued that perhaps Jesus was moved by the mores of his time as a Jew in that time. And yet we see that in so many ways Jesus was truly radical in relation to the mores of his time, and indeed he was very radical in his welcome of, appreciation of, and inclusion of women in his close group. So there's the fact of Jesus' choice. Then the fact of the apostles, the church of the apostles, the church of the New Testament, and indeed the church throughout history, maintaining this same practice of a male-only priesthood. And they clearly did it out of loyalty to what the Lord had done before them. Particularly in the Greco-Roman world, there were other possibilities. Among the Jews, they did not see the possibility of women priests. But in the Greco-Roman world, there are, as we know, there were other religions where female priesthood was a real possibility. And if the church had been in any way moved or inspired, it could well have followed that lead, and it didn't. And then that brings us up through all the centuries to our own time, when for the first time the question really arose as a possibility in the 20th century. And there you have some very clear teaching. In the time of Paul VI, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at that time, at his behest, issued a very clear statement saying that the church does not consider herself authorized to admit women to priestly vocation. Paul VI, I think, would have thought that that was a clear statement of the church's practice throughout history, and that it would be enough. John Paul II came along, and it still seemed to be an open question, and he taught very clearly about it. In fact, he, in his encyclical Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, he uses some of the language that is in Lumen Gentium in Vatican II surrounding the exercise of infallibility in teaching, where he said, in order that all doubt may be removed regarding a matter of great importance, which pertains to the church's divine constitution itself. He's referring to ideas in Vatican II. And then he says, in virtue of my ministry of confirming the brethren. That's from Luke 22, but it is in Lumen Gentium. Then he says, I declare that the church has no authority whatsoever to confer priestly ordination on women, and that this judgment is to be definitively held by all the church's faithful. The Pope at that time saw that as something definitive. Like for me, that raises the question of the authority of the church to teach, the right of the lay faithful to rely on the church. Can we expect the church to teach us the truth about a matter of great importance pertaining to the church's constitution? And John Paul believed that we could, and that he was doing that. So, like, for those reasons, to do with the authority of the church, I am convinced that the church cannot change this teaching. Okay, so, however, I know that that is not convincing for everybody. It seems not to be convincing for many people. And I know I have heard you speak about this, Abigail, so I really want to draw you in here. You weren't always convinced by the argument that I have just presented, and I think it has something to do with your own journey. I enjoyed hearing about it, so could you just talk to that now, please?
Sure. So I've been Catholic, let's see, what year is it? I've been Catholic for 12 years, and I was raised in a Protestant tradition that did not ordain women, that didn't have women in leadership. And when I became a young woman, that really bothered me. And so in college, when I went off to study at university and began to study feminist theology and feminist biblical criticism, I became very much a supporter of women's ordination. That became almost like a litmus test for me about whether or not I could be part of a church, right? So I preface my views with that because I really want to say that this used to really be a big deal for me. This used to be a really big stumbling block, a really big obstacle for me. And so I understand what it's like to be very confused and frustrated with this teaching. So when I began the process of becoming Catholic, I read that document that you mentioned, but also there's an earlier one, and I didn't write down the title, but really spells out the reasons why the church says what it says about women's ordination. And the first few reasons are the ones you've just outlined, right? The Christ's example, the unwavering tradition of the church across time, but also across different kind of schools of theology. And but there's another one that's listed, and this is the one that not only did I kind of grudgingly accept it, but it really changed my heart on the matter. And that's the argument from the sacramental argument, really. So let me see if I can kind of present it, and then if you want me to, dig in or to elaborate on any of it. But I'll just kind of present it very simply at first. Hold on, let me clear my throat. So when I start to tell this to children, actually, like say if a young girl came up and said, "Why can't I be a priest?" In the most simplest way, what I would say is, well, if you were going to direct a play about Jesus, about the life of Christ, who would you have play the role of Christ? Would you have a boy play the role of Christ or a girl? And who would you have play the role of Mary, right? Would you choose a boy or a girl? And usually just, well, I would choose a boy to play Christ. I would choose a girl. And I said, well, that's why. Because here's something I think we don't often understand as moderns, that the Mass is really, it's a liturgical drama in many ways. It's a play, like what's happening really. It's a kind of staging of the nuptial union of the church and Christ, right? And so every gesture is meaningful in the Mass. Every material object is meaningful in the Mass and is speaking something important. And that is also true of the body of the priest. Okay, so when we're in a sacramental context, signs matter, right? So that's like the first thing to understand in thinking this way. We're entering into kind of a different way of seeing when we come into a sacramental context. Now, of course, I hope that this teaches us to see all of reality as sacramental, right? But there's something particularly happening in the Mass where the signs matter. So the fact that, um, there's this moment in the Mass where the priest mixes a little bit of the wine in the water, right? Which often, as a layperson, you don't even necessarily know what's going on, right? But that's a symbol of the incarnation, right? And the fact that we have wine that is the sign of the blood of Christ and bread that is the sign of the body of Christ. You couldn't just swap those out for, Guinness or, a piece of pizza or something, right? Without really disrupting what's going on. And so I think that's also true of what I was saying where I was talking to the girl, right? If she were to cast a girl to play Christ, which sometimes they do in the theater, let's do a Shakespearean play with all women, right? Which is fine to do, but it is disruptive, right? It disrupts the expectations. There's something happening there that is against the grain, right? So a similar thing would happen in the Mass if we were to just kind of swap out um, the priest who is male with a priestess who is female. And what would be disrupted there is the image of the bridegroom, the image of Christ as bridegroom, and the image of Christ as high priest, right, who is the bridegroom. So that nuptial imagery would really be disrupted, which is so essential to the Mass. And it's not just that would disrupt the imagery in the Mass, but I think that would also it would also, to me, it would be like tacitly saying that our bodies aren't signs, that our bodies don't actually carry a sacramental meaning, right? But that we're these kind of blank interchangeable units that you can just kind of swap a man out for a woman and nothing really makes a difference. So the reason my heart was really changed on this, because part of embracing this vision I'm trying to articulate is also embracing an understanding of my own embodiment as a woman as having a sacramental meaning, right? And so in my own person, I carry the image of the bride, right? There's a way in which when we think sacramentally, it is the woman who is representative of all humankind, right? As bride. And I find that to be incredibly beautiful and powerful, right? And so I don't want to disrupt that symbolism any more than I would want to disrupt the symbolism of the bridegroom in the Mass. And I've also thought about this in relation to confession as well, and how important it is to have, I think, the paternal mercy of the Father present in the sacrament of forgiveness as well. So there's something really important about the iconography of our bodies, I think, that we would completely lose if we were to just, even out of a good impulse, out of an impulse of, justice and women's dignity, but what we would lose would be to really step out of a sacramental way of seeing, which I think would actually be a spiritual catastrophe, personally. So
I haven't heard that articulation of the significance of the female body as representing the bride, the welcome of God on the part of humanity. I haven't heard that articulated as strongly before. But there does seem to be it's hard to get away from a superior inferior notion of male female and how do we, and particularly when ordination is also linked to leadership
mhm.
in our church. Just looking at it from the other side.
Yep.
Um, how can we genuinely celebrate this sacramentality of the human body, male and female, and see it as perfectly affirmed, and then at the same time recognize the problem uh, around superior, inferior in terms of leadership?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think there's an interesting conversation to be had there, right? If we kind of take as a maybe a foundational premise that we're not going to disrupt the sacramental priesthood in that way. But then the question about other forms of leadership in the church, of administrative leadership in the church, right? I think there's a very interesting conversation to be had there. Do some of the existing ways of structuring the church, where priests are kind of put in extra sacramental roles, do those have to be limited to priests, or can those be extended to lay women or women and also lay men? That's a really interesting conversation to have, and I think that conversation is beginning. It really is happening in the church, and
How
should
do, how do,
continue. Yeah.
how do you see it happening?
Well, I think Pope Francis, began by, I mean, he appointed some like a woman religious, and then a very high administrative position in the Vatican, for example. So those sorts of conversations, and practices, I guess, and those are really important, because I think in some ways, the problem isn't, maybe part of the problem is clericalism, right? Um, and ironically, I actually think that saying, well, women can only have an influence in the church if they're priests, that actually is a clericalist position, right?
Yes, yes.
Um, so, sometimes when I, again, understandably hear young women kind of say, well, I don't feel valued in the church because I can't be a priest, I think there's almost like a self-defeating mindset there, because there's so much women can do in the church even now. Um, there and there's no reason to kind of hold back the call of God in your life simply because there's like one role in the church, that is closed off. And I think the like wide range of holiness that we see in women saints shows this, right? I mean, some of my favorite some of my favorite female saints, like let's say Saint Hildegard, for example. She lived in the Middle Ages during the time of the investiture crisis. So it was a time of great corruption in the clergy. And she was always writing these really fiery letters to priests, to bishops, even to popes, and she was exhorting them to be holy, right? So these, and, St. Catherine of Siena is another example. So these are women who had a lot of power and authority in the church, but they weren't clamoring to be priests. They were clamoring for priests to be holy. And so I think that there's actually this profound prophetic power that women have in the church, and it's almost better heard if it's outside the clerical system and kind of speaking to the clerical system in this prophetic way, rather than wanting to be simply integrated into it, right? So I think there's a real important role that women have in the church. And that was something that surprised me when I became Catholic, because as a Protestant, when women weren't ordained or allowed to be pastors, what that usually meant was that they couldn't lead at all, they couldn't teach at all, they couldn't preach at all. So I've been very surprised in a Catholic context to see women in roles of leadership, to see women preaching and teaching and spreading the word and evangelizing. Um, and I've never felt hemmed in by the fact that I'm a woman as a Catholic. I've never felt that has closed any meaningful doors to do the work that I'm called to do. And so I think there's so much that women can do already, in the church, um, and that we
I
shouldn't hold ourselves back.
yeah, I I agree. Uh, but even historically, and I'm talking about the recent history, not even beginning to go to uh, Catherine of Siena and Hildegard at Bingen and so on, but the the leadership of usually women religious in running major institutions in healthcare and education and so on. That was a given of my youth. just expecting to see particularly women religious, and it was women religious in our world who were leaders and were expected to be. That, of course, within a very different the overall culture in which we lived was could be dubbed more patriarchal, and yet this was going on and was expected within the church. But something new is happening within the laity, and the role of the laity, in which women are already and will play a leading role is. I've always felt that the big revolution of Vatican II was going to be about the vocation and the mission of the laity. And yet we have argued almost ever since about who can and can't be priests, which takes away, I think, and blunts the effectiveness of that great call to holiness for everyone and to mission for everyone.
And I do want to make clear as well that there's a difference between representation and participation, right? So even though only a male body can, in a, I guess, iconic way, represent Christ in the Mass, of course, all the gathered faithful there, I mean, the whole reason we're at Mass is to be incorporated into Christ, is to be united to Christ. So the sacramental reality of what's happening, we all have access to that. We all participate in that. So to represent something does not mean to possess it or to kind of only like to exclude everyone else from it, right? So for example, when I talked about the fact that as a woman, I represent the bride, but men participate in the reality of being the bride as well, even priests, right? I mean, priests are participating in that bridal reality, even as they are representing in the sacramental context Christ, right? So it's important to get that right, because sometimes I'll hear people say, like when I present this way of thinking, well, can't a woman represent Christ? And the answer to that is, well, yes and no. I mean, there's a way in which a woman can. Of course, every saint, is Christ-like, is making present the love of Christ. But a female body can't evoke the symbolism of bridegroom or father, right? So there is this kind of image language that you see in divine revelation that God speaks to us through. God really speaks to us mostly through images, not through just lists of rules, but really through stories and through images. I mean, just listen for it. As you go to Mass, just listen to the readings and hear how much Scripture uses images. And so there's this kind of symbolic meaning to the visible world, including our bodies. And God has chosen to tell something of his story through those visible realities, right? And so we don't completely determine the meaning of our own image quality, if that makes sense, right? I don't just get to decide what I represent. Okay, that's something we receive. But it's not, again, it's not a closed door in the sense that I participate in the reality of becoming Christ, through the sacraments, even though I can't represent Christ iconographically in the Mass.
Right? Yes, but Christ is as present in you and through you to the world as he is in and through me, either me as a man or me as a priest. So there's something really important here about imaging and valuing imaging. As a male, I image one thing, you as a female image another. and yet we both. This is it. This is tricky. It really is. It is fascinating. How is it that, in a very real sense, we are both in persona Christi? We are both.
Hmm.
Christ lives in us. He became human. He became one of us, and
Hmm.
he is in you as he is in me, um, and that is essential.
Hmm.
And then there's this thing about us imaging,
Hmm.
uh, two
And it's, yeah.
complementary things.
And especially again in the sacramental liturgical context where the signs really matter, right?
Yes.
And so there are other ways that God extends his grace into our lives. Um, but in the sacramental system of giving us grace, right? There's definitely a symbolic language that matters there. And that's what really sets the church apart. I mean, there's a lot of things that set the church apart, but the church isn't just a sociological reality. It's not just a political reality. It's not like another earthly organization, right? And so sometimes I think we think, well, if women can do as much as what a man can do, then why don't we just give them the same jobs, right? Because that's what we do with schools. That's how we, structure our governments now, right? And that makes sense in those contexts. But what's happening in mass, right, and what's happening in the church, which is the church is a mystery. It's the mystery of Christ's incarnation, continually made present for all of humankind. And so, um, in that in that context, um, signs really matter in a way that just doesn't translate if you think about, some other just kind of secular organization, right? So to really understand this way of thinking, we had to step into a different way of seeing, which I think used to be much more intuitive. Um, but in the modern world, where we tend to think more in abstractions, um, we lose sight of the importance of the image.
So we have to, it's recovering a way of being in the world, a way of processing reality that, and again, are you saying that in order to really appreciate the sacraments and really uh, to get the graces from them, we have to recover an earlier way, and an earlier, more intuitive way of being in the world than the one that we all actually live in right now?
Yeah, if I mean, I don't know that you have to. I don't think it would like necessarily interfere with getting the graces, but I think it would attune you to the reality of what's happening, right? We
Yes.
better see what's happening in mass when we see what the signs mean and when we see reality in terms of signs through which God speaks. That attunes us to what's happening in mass in an important way. And so I think when we're not attuned to that, then it's much more easy just to kind of fall into the thinking of, well, why not just swap out a man with a woman, right? Why would that matter? Um, well, it matters because our bodies matter, and it matters because signs matter. Um, so, but if you're not thinking in terms of signs, then that reasoning, I think, um, doesn't really land.
Yeah.
Yes.
So just drawing it to a close, what is the invitation, uh, both to men and women, around? I mean, as I said, you had interesting things to say about the sign value of both the female body and the male body. That is fresh for me. What is the invitation for us as men and women, uh, as we pray, as we are in the world, and particularly as we celebrate the sacraments?
Well, I guess one way to think about it, and this is maybe how personally um, I've thought about it. I mean, in a way, we're living icons, right? So there's a symbolism that I carry in the kind of being that I am, that reflects the image language of God in a particular way. But I also have free will, and so I can choose to live faithfully with that image, or I can kind of choose again to disrupt it, right? I can choose to be a bad icon. I could choose to represent to the world other things. And so I guess maybe the invitation is to ask, what would it look like to be a faithful icon, right? What would it look like for someone, for, to live in the world where, like for men, for example, where they're a faithful image of the paternal love of God, or a faithful image of the love of the bridegroom, right?
Mhm.
And what would it look like for me to be a faithful image of fidelity, and to try to live in a way that's faithful to that iconography, I think. It would be wonderful if that was the way priests thought about it, right? Not as a, oh, I'm, which I don't, honestly, I don't know many priests who do think this way, but I guess this is the cliche, oh, I'm a priest and so I have power over people, right? But of course, that's not what it means to be a priest. And in fact, if one is a particular icon of Christ, then that means, being on a crucifix. So that again is not that's not a symbol that's intelligible to the world, right? So power means something different, I think, in a Catholic register as well. But yeah, what would it look like for priests to think about how can I be faithful to this iconography that I carry? How can I, because when we're not, here's the thing, when we're not, especially I think for priests, if they're supposed to kind of transmit this incarnate image of paternal love, when they do it badly, that disrupts the love of God in a way, right? Then what should be kind of a faithful transmission of God's love, can become a distortion and actually lead people astray, which is why scandals are so destructive, right? Um, so I think being faithful icons, I guess, would be the invitation.
I really like that. And I will think about it, and I hope others will. And we may come back to this and dig into it a good deal deeper. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.